Right now, the Colorado River system is entering emergency operations designed to protect Lake Powell, a reservoir connected to the water security of roughly 40 million people across the American West. Federal managers are preparing to move as much as 2.48 million acre-feet of water toward Lake Powell, partly by drawing from Flaming Gorge Reservoir and partly by reducing the water released downstream. That intervention is extraordinary because it does not create new water. It shifts scarcity from one reservoir to another, protecting one critical structure while increasing pressure somewhere else. Lake Mead could fall faster, and Hoover Dam's hydropower capacity could decline sharply. But that is not the most frightening part. The emergency is arriving as the rules governing the river approach expiration, while the 7 basin states remain divided over what should replace them. The system is therefore confronting a physical shortage and a political deadline at the same time. August could become the month when new projections determine how Lake Powell and Lake Mead will operate, how deeply water deliveries may be reduced, and who will absorb the next layer of risk. The question is no longer whether the river can survive another dry year. The question is whether a management system built for the climate of the past can be rewritten before the water forces its own rules. Anyone following this unfolding story can support the investigation by liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment with the place they currently call home. Across the Colorado River Basin, the emergency is not unfolding as a single dramatic wall of water, a sudden evacuation order, or a storm visible from space. It is moving through gauges, release schedules, reservoir elevations, irrigation districts, power markets, and the quiet decisions of people who must determine which part of the system can afford to lose water, so another part does not fail. At Lake Powell, the Bureau of Reclamation is now operating under an emergency strategy meant to keep the reservoir safely above the elevations where Glen Canyon Dam begins losing critical flexibility. The immediate action has 2 major components. Water is being released from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, far upstream on the Green River, and less water is being sent from Lake Powell toward Lake Mead. Together, those measures can retain or add as much as roughly 2.48 million acre-feet in Lake Powell. That volume sounds like rescue. In reality, it is redistribution. The water is not appearing from a new storm, a new aquifer, or an unexpected surge of snowmelt. It is being moved across the basin's internal balance sheet. Flaming Gorge is being drawn down to support Powell, while Lake Mead receives less water from upstream. One reservoir gains time, another inherits more pressure. The first people affected are not only those standing beside the receding shorelines. The Colorado River provides municipal water to approximately 40 million people across 7 American states and Mexico. Its water reaches homes in Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego, Denver, Salt Lake City, Albuquerque, and many smaller communities that rarely appear in national coverage. It supports about 5.5 million acres of farmland, including agricultural districts that grow winter vegetables, forage crops, fruit, and other products that move through grocery stores far beyond the desert Southwest. It serves 30 tribal nations, some of which hold senior legal rights but still lack complete infrastructure to deliver secure water to every household. It also supports wildlife refuges, national parks, recreation economies, industrial users, and hydroelectric plants, whose electricity helps stabilize the Western grid. That is why the scene cannot be understood by looking at one reservoir alone. At Flaming Gorge, the emergency appears as water being released from storage that local communities, boaters, fisheries, and future water managers had expected to remain available. Federal plans have considered sending between roughly 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet from that reservoir over the emergency period. Flaming Gorge entered the operation in comparatively strong condition, holding about 3.1 million acre-feet, or approximately 83% of capacity when the intervention was announced. Yet, the planned releases could lower its surface by roughly 35 feet and leave it near 59% of capacity. Contracted water rights are not expected to be interrupted, but the physical reserve will be smaller. The reservoir is functioning like an emergency battery connected to a larger electrical system. It can discharge energy into the network, but every unit sent outward leaves less protection behind. At Lake Powell, the pressure is more immediate. The runoff that normally rebuilds the reservoir after winter arrived at a fraction of what the system had been designed to expect. Federal forecasters placed the most probable unregulated inflow for the water year at about 3.5 million acre-feet, only 36% of the modern average. Earlier minimum projections had been even lower. The phrase unregulated inflow refers to the water that would naturally enter the reservoir without the effects of upstream storage and diversions. It is one of the clearest indicators of how much the mountain basin is actually producing. In this case, the river's natural income is deeply below normal, while its obligations continue. The Bureau of Reclamation's July modeling placed Lake Powell near 5.05 million acre-feet in storage at the end of the water year, roughly 22% of capacity. That does not mean the remaining water is evenly usable. Reservoirs are three-dimensional machines. As the surface falls, the pressure pushing water through the dam changes, boat access becomes harder, intake structures approach danger zones, and hydropower turbines lose the hydraulic head they need to operate efficiently. Glen Canyon Dam's minimum power pool is near an elevation of 3,490 feet. Below that level, normal turbine releases become severely constrained, and water may have to pass through lower river outlet works that were not intended to serve indefinitely as the primary operating pathway. The emergency strategy is intended to prevent that threshold from being crossed, but the threshold is not merely a line painted on concrete. It is the point where a storage crisis begins transforming into an infrastructure crisis. Downstream, Lake Mead is absorbing the cost of that protection. The annual release from Lake Powell has been reduced from the previously projected 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet. That difference, about 1.48 million acre-feet, stays in Powell rather than flowing toward Mead. For Lake Powell, the retained water creates elevation and operating space. For Lake Mead, it means the reservoir can decline more quickly than it otherwise would. Federal officials have warned that the reduced inflow could contribute to an additional loss of as much as 40% of Hoover Dam's hydropower generating capacity as early as the fall. That warning matters because Hoover Dam is not simply a monument behind a lake. Its electricity is woven into the regional power system, serving utilities and public agencies across the Southwest. Hydropower is especially valuable because operators can adjust generation rapidly, helping the grid respond when demand spikes or another power source suddenly drops. During extreme heat, when air conditioners drive electricity use upward, losing flexible hydropower is like removing a shock absorber from a vehicle just as the road becomes rougher. The water users facing the greatest near-term vulnerability are not distributed equally. Arizona has historically absorbed large portions of formal lower basin shortage reductions through the Central Arizona Project, the canal system that lifts Colorado River water hundreds of miles toward Phoenix and Tucson. Agricultural districts with lower priority entitlements can lose deliveries before many urban users notice any change at a household faucet. That means a shortage may first appear not as a dry kitchen sink, but as fallowed land, fewer planted acres, greater groundwater pumping, higher operating costs, and farm income disappearing from communities built around irrigation. Nevada receives a smaller total allocation, but depends heavily on Lake Mead for the Las Vegas metropolitan area. Southern Nevada has developed aggressive conservation programs, recycling nearly all indoor water back to the lake and reducing per-person demand, yet the system still depends on intake structures, pumping capacity, and reservoir elevations remaining operational. California holds large and legally significant Colorado River entitlements and supports some of the most productive irrigated land in the country. Its cities and agricultural districts have also conserved water, but any long-term rebalancing of the river inevitably reaches questions of law, priority, food production, urban growth, and who is required to reduce use first. Mexico is part of the same physical system through an international treaty and subsequent agreements. Water crossing the border, supports cities, farms, and ecological restoration in the Colorado River Delta. Reduced deliveries or altered reservoir operations therefore carry consequences beyond the 7 basin states. Tribal communities face another layer of exposure. Many tribal nations possess recognized or unresolved claims to Colorado River water. Yet, legal entitlement does not automatically produce a pipe, treatment plant, pumping station, or reliable household connection. A basin-wide shortage can intensify the contradiction of communities holding rights on paper while families still haul water or depend on vulnerable local supplies. Emergency management that focuses only on existing diversion records can preserve the patterns of the past, including inequities embedded within them. The official warning is therefore broader than the possibility of one dam losing hydropower. Reclamation has described elevated risks to essential water and power infrastructure throughout the basin. Total system storage began the water year at roughly 37% of capacity, down from about 43% 1 year earlier. By early summer, the combined system was near 1/3 full. Those percentages are not countdown clocks showing the exact day water disappears, but they measure the shrinking safety margin available to absorb another poor snow season, another extreme heat wave, another failed runoff forecast, or another year when negotiations do not produce sufficient reductions. The people watching these numbers most closely include reservoir operators, irrigation managers, municipal utilities, power agencies, governors, federal officials, tribal governments, environmental groups, and Mexican authorities. Each sees a different failure point. A dam operator sees turbine elevation. A farmer sees the next planting decision. A city sees treatment capacity and demand forecasts. A power manager sees megawatts disappearing during peak heat. A tribal community may see another emergency plan written around infrastructure it was never fully given. An ecosystem manager sees colder river habitat narrowing as reservoirs warm and releases change. The seriousness comes from those failure points beginning to converge. The public should care because the Colorado River is not an isolated desert waterway. It is a supply chain disguised as a river. Water enters as mountain snow, passes through soil and tributaries, is stored behind dams, converted into electricity, lifted through canals, delivered to fields and cities, incorporated into food and industry, and negotiated through laws written across generations. When inflow collapses, the disturbance travels through every link. It moves from the mountains into Lake Powell, from Lake Powell into Glen Canyon Dam, from reduced releases into Lake Mead, from Lake Mead into Hoover Dam, from Hoover into the power grid, and from the canals into farms, household budgets, and food prices. The emergency now active is an attempt to slow that movement before it reaches the most fragile components. It may succeed in protecting Lake Powell through the immediate danger, but the scene across the basin reveals the cost of that success. The system is no longer deciding how to distribute abundance. It is deciding where scarcity can be placed without causing the next break. The largest number in this emergency is not the elevation of one reservoir. It is the amount of protection that has disappeared from the entire Colorado River system. At the beginning of the current water year, the major reservoirs across the basin held about 21.8 million acre-feet, roughly 37% of their combined capacity. By early summer, that total had fallen to approximately 19.6 million acre-feet, or about 34%. 1 year earlier, the same system held roughly 23.5 million acre-feet. In less than a year, nearly 4 million acre-feet of stored water had vanished from the basin's balance sheet. An acre-foot is the amount of water required to cover 1 acre of land, 1 foot deep, equal to about 326,000 gallons. 4 million acre-feet, therefore, represents approximately 1.3 trillion gallons. It is enough water to fill nearly 2 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. It is also larger than the annual household water use of many major metropolitan areas combined. Yet, the most important fact is not the spectacle of that volume. It is that this water was supposed to function as insurance. Reservoir storage exists because mountain runoff is uneven. Wet years make deposits. Dry years require withdrawals. The system becomes dangerous when withdrawals continue but the deposits fail to arrive. That is what the numbers now reveal. The Colorado River Basin's storage is not simply low. It is losing the margin that allows managers to survive forecasting errors, heat waves, poor snow seasons, infrastructure failures, and political delay. Lake Powell makes that loss visible. Under the most probable federal projection, unregulated inflow into the reservoir for the water year is expected to total about 3.5 million acre-feet. That is only 36% of the modern average. In ordinary language, the watershed is producing little more than 1/3 of the water that managers would normally expect. The missing 2/3 does not appear as an empty space in the sky. It appears as snow that never accumulated, snow that melted too early, water absorbed by dry soils, water consumed by vegetation, and runoff that failed to reach the channel. 3.5 million acre-feet still sounds enormous. It equals roughly 1.1 trillion gallons. But scale becomes meaningful only when income is compared with obligation. Lake Powell had previously been scheduled to release 7.48 million acre-feet downstream during the water year. The river was therefore being asked to send out more than twice the projected natural inflow entering the reservoir. Storage could cover the difference for a while. That is what reservoirs are built to do. But when the same imbalance repeats across multiple years, the reservoir stops behaving like a savings account and begins behaving like a battery being discharged without a reliable charger. The emergency response reduces Powell's annual release to 6 million acre-feet. The difference is 1.48 million acre-feet retained behind Glen Canyon Dam. That volume equals approximately 482 billion gallons. Spread evenly across the city of Los Angeles, it would cover the entire city under several feet of water. Divided among 40 million people, it would amount to more than 12,000 gallons for every person dependent on the river. Expressed as swimming pools, it would fill more than 700,000 Olympic-sized pools. But none of those comparisons means the basin has suddenly found a vast new supply. The water remains in Lake Powell only because it will not reach Lake Mead on the original schedule. The headline number is therefore not a rescue volume, it is a transferred deficit. Lake Powell receives more operating space. Lake Mead receives less inflow. At the same time, between roughly 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet may be released from Flaming Gorge Reservoir to support Powell. At the upper end, that transfer equals about 326 billion gallons. Flaming Gorge began the emergency period in comparatively strong condition, holding approximately 3.1 million acre-feet, close to 83% of capacity. But the planned release could lower its surface by roughly 35 feet and reduce it toward 59% of capacity. 35 feet is close to the height of a 3-story building. That decline may unfold across a broad reservoir rather than beside one vertical wall, but it represents a deliberate withdrawal from one of the healthiest large storage accounts in the upper basin. Again, the system is not receiving water. It is moving stored water toward the point of greatest immediate danger. The numbers become even more revealing when Lake Powell's projected storage is compared with its full capacity. Federal modeling places the reservoir near 5.05 million acre-feet at the end of the water year, around 22% full. That means almost 4/5 of its storage space could be empty. Yet even the phrase 22% full can be misleading, because not every remaining gallon has the same operational value. Water near the upper elevations provides pressure for hydropower, flexibility for releases, room for error, and distance from critical dam thresholds. Water near the bottom provides far less of each. A drinking glass at 22% still allows nearly all of its remaining contents to be poured. A reservoir behind a massive dam does not work that way. Its outlets sit at fixed elevations. Its turbines require hydraulic pressure. Its shoreline geometry changes as the level falls. Sediment, temperature, water quality, recreation access, and power generation all respond before the reservoir reaches zero. Glen Canyon Dam's minimum power pool lies near an elevation of 3,490 feet. The emergency strategy is intended to keep Lake Powell above approximately 3,500 feet, leaving a buffer of only about 10 vertical feet above that critical power threshold. 10 feet may sound comfortable when measured against the height of a person. Across a reservoir whose surface can move rapidly under poor inflow and continued releases, it is a narrow operating corridor. It is the difference between normal turbine operations and a condition in which managers could become increasingly dependent on lower outlet works. The scale of the system makes that narrow margin more unsettling. Lake Powell and Lake Mead were constructed as the two giant stabilizers of the river, together capable of storing tens of millions of acre-feet. They were meant to smooth the difference between wet and dry periods across many years. When both remain depleted, the basin loses its ability to treat one bad year as an isolated event. Every new dry year begins closer to an infrastructure threshold. Every forecast carries more weight. Every operational decision transfers a larger share of risk. Lake Mead illustrates the downstream side of the equation. Reducing Powell's release by 1.48 million acre-feet means that Mead could receive hundreds of billions fewer gallons than previously planned. Hoover Dam can continue producing electricity at reduced reservoir elevations, but lower water means lower hydraulic head, and lower head means less generating capacity. Federal officials have warned that the changed operation could contribute to the loss of as much as 40% of Hoover Dam's hydropower capacity as early as the fall. 40% is not the same as 40% of the entire Western electrical grid, and it would be misleading to describe it that way. Hoover represents only one part of a much larger power system, but hydropower provides something that raw percentages do not capture: rapid, controllable generation that can respond when electricity demand surges. The loss therefore matters most during the hours when the grid is already under pressure, especially during extreme heat. The river's human scale is just as large. More than 40 million people receive some form of municipal water connected to the Colorado River system. The basin supports about 5.5 million acres of irrigated agriculture. That agricultural area equals roughly 8,600 square miles, an expanse comparable to an entire small American state. It supplies communities and markets far beyond the basin, meaning that a shortage can travel outward through produce prices, livestock costs, farm employment, processing plants, transportation networks, and household food budgets. The system also serves 30 tribal nations and 2 Mexican states. Those numbers are often repeated because they are large, but repetition can make them feel abstract. 40 million people means that roughly 1 out of every 8 residents of the United States is connected, directly or indirectly, to this river's municipal supply network. 5.5 million agricultural acres means millions of individual planting decisions depend on canals, pumping stations, contracts, soil conditions, and delivery schedules. 30 tribal nations means 30 distinct governments, histories, legal positions, infrastructure conditions, and unresolved questions of access. The headline is therefore not that the river is about to disappear. It is not. Nor is the headline that every city will suddenly lose tap water. Most urban systems possess conservation programs, groundwater reserves, alternative supplies, or legal protections that can delay such an outcome. The true headline is that a system designed to create distance between society and drought is rapidly losing that distance. 34% total storage, 36% of average inflow, 22% projected storage at Lake Powell, a 6 million acre-foot release, up to 1 million acre-feet drawn from Flaming Gorge, and a possible 40% reduction in Hoover Dam's generating capacity are not separate statistics. They are measurements of the same contraction. The basin is being compressed between lower natural supply and obligations built during a wetter historical period. Each percentage marks another layer of flexibility being consumed. Each million acre-feet moved from one location to another is time purchased with water borrowed from somewhere else. That is why the numbers are abnormal. A single low reservoir can be supported by another reservoir, A single poor runoff year can be covered by stored water. A temporary power loss can be replaced by other generators. But when storage, runoff, hydropower, agriculture, urban demand, and political deadlines tighten at the same time, the system begins to lose the ability to isolate one problem from the next. The most alarming number is therefore not 1.48 million, 3.5 million, or 19.6 million acre-feet. It is 1/3. The Colorado River's major storage system is moving through summer, with only about 1/3 of its capacity remaining. And part of that remaining water must now be rearranged simply to keep critical infrastructure away from dangerous thresholds. The reservoirs are still vast. The river is still flowing. Deliveries are still being made. But the protective space between normal operations and emergency operations has narrowed into a band measured in percentages, release volumes, and a small number of vertical feet. The system has not run out of water. It is running out of easy choices. The hidden danger in the Colorado River emergency is not simply how little water remains. It is how little time remains for every part of the system to adjust before the next decision becomes unavoidable. A reservoir can survive a low year if managers have enough warning, enough storage, enough political agreement, and enough flexibility to reduce releases gradually. A government can rewrite operating rules if negotiators have years to test proposals, resolve legal disputes, consult tribal nations, coordinate with Mexico, and explain painful reductions to the public. A city can adapt if it has time to build recycling plants, deepen intakes, repair leaking pipes, change landscaping, and develop alternative supplies. A farmer can change crops if the decision arrives before seed is purchased, land is prepared, workers are hired, and contracts are signed. But when the physical river changes faster than the institutions built to manage it, every adjustment becomes more expensive, more disruptive, and more likely to push risk onto somebody else. That is the deeper meaning of the emergency, now active. It is not only a water shortage, it is a collision between hydrologic time and political time. Hydrologic time is moving through the basin every hour. Summer heat is drawing moisture from soils, vegetation, canals, and reservoir surfaces. Water released through a dam cannot be called back. Snow that failed to accumulate during winter cannot be manufactured during July. Runoff that was absorbed by dry ground has already disappeared from the year's usable supply. Political time moves differently. It advances through meetings, draft documents, public comments, environmental reviews, negotiations, litigation risks, funding decisions, and agreements among governments with different laws and different priorities. The river does not pause while those processes continue. That is why August matters. Each year, the Bureau of Reclamation's August 24-month study helps establish how Lake Powell and Lake Mead will be operated during the following year. The forecast uses projected reservoir elevations to determine release tiers, shortage conditions, and required reductions under the rules currently governing the system. In a stable basin, that annual process would be technical and predictable. Managers would examine snowpack, runoff, demand, and storage, then select the operating category associated with the projected elevation. But the present basin is no longer stable enough for those categories to feel routine. A small change in projected inflow can move a reservoir toward a different operational threshold. A few vertical feet can influence how much water is released, whether additional shortages are declared, and how much pressure falls on farms, cities, power generation, and upstream storage. The calendar is therefore becoming part of the hazard. August is not dangerous because the month itself changes the river. It is dangerous because the system must translate an uncertain physical future into binding operational decisions at a specific moment. The forecast may contain ranges, but the resulting actions affect real deliveries. Once a release schedule is established, water begins moving through dams, canals, contracts, and budgets. If later conditions become worse, managers must search for emergency flexibility. If conditions improve, water already withheld or transferred may have imposed costs that cannot be completely reversed. The problem is not that forecasting is useless. The problem is that forecasts become more consequential as the margin for error shrinks. When reservoirs are high, an inaccurate runoff estimate can be absorbed by storage. When reservoirs approach critical elevations, the same forecasting error can push operations toward infrastructure limits. This is the part easily missed when attention stays fixed on a single headline number. The threat is not merely that Lake Powell could fall. The threat is that it could fall faster than agencies, states, utilities, farms, and power systems can reorganize around the decline. The emergency measures are buying time by retaining more water in Powell and drawing support from Flaming Gorge. But purchased time is not the same as solved scarcity. It resembles moving sandbags along a weakening levee. The barrier may hold at the most threatened point, but every bag came from somewhere. Every worker has limits, and the water continues pressing against the structure. The extra storage at Powell creates distance from minimum power pool. The reduced release, however, sends less water toward Mead. The Flaming Gorge release supports Powell, but it lowers another reservoir that may be needed during future drought. The intervention slows one countdown by accelerating another. That is why the central issue is not water alone, it is duration. How long will low runoff continue? How many reservoirs can be used as emergency reserves before their own buffers become thin? How many consecutive years can agriculture, hydropower, ecosystems, and communities absorb temporary measures before temporary becomes permanent? How long can negotiators depend on emergency flexibility while the governing framework itself approaches expiration? The current operating system was built around the 2007 interim guidelines and later drought agreements intended to coordinate Lake Powell and Lake Mead through the end of 2026. Those rules were designed to provide predictability during shortage, but they were not intended to govern the river forever. Their expiration has been known for years, and the federal government has been developing successor rules for post-2026 operations. A draft environmental impact statement released several alternatives for managing the reservoirs under a wider range of future conditions. More than 18,000 public submissions were received during the review period. That volume of participation demonstrates the scale of what is at stake, but it also reveals the number of interests that must somehow be reconciled. 7 basin states, the federal government, 30 tribal nations, Mexico, agricultural districts, cities, power customers, environmental interests, and communities tied to reservoir economies do not enter the discussion from the same position. Each possesses different rights, infrastructure, vulnerabilities, and definitions of fairness. The upper basin states point toward the river's changing supply and the difficulty of controlling snow-dependent runoff. The lower basin states confront large delivery systems, massive agricultural use, and metropolitan populations that cannot be rapidly relocated. Tribes seek a meaningful role in decisions governing water, to which many hold legally significant rights. Mexico depends on international agreements. Environmental managers must consider rivers, fish, wetlands, water temperature, and habitat that cannot negotiate for themselves. All of them are connected to the same shrinking storage system. Yet each experiences the shortage through a different clock. A city measures time in decades because major infrastructure may require years of permitting and construction. A farmer measures time in seasons because a missed planting window can erase an entire year of income. A reservoir operator measures time in days, release volumes, and vertical feet. A fish population may experience time through one dangerously warm season. A household without reliable water experiences it every morning. The system must coordinate all of those clocks, while the river follows only one physical rule. Water available today cannot be promised twice. This is why the approaching transition in operating rules is more than an administrative update. The old framework was created during a period when managers still expected drought to eventually give way to conditions resembling the 20th century record. The emerging framework must confront the possibility that lower flows, higher temperatures, earlier snowmelt, and greater evaporation are not temporary interruptions, but persistent features. That changes the purpose of the rules. They can no longer focus only on dividing shortages after reservoir elevations fall. They must determine how quickly use should decline before those elevations are reached, who bears reductions, how upstream and downstream risks are shared, whether releases should respond to reservoir storage or measured supply, and how the system behaves when neither Powell nor Mead has enough water to protect the other. Every one of those questions becomes harder when time is short. A negotiated reduction made early can be planned. The same reduction imposed after a reservoir crosses a critical threshold becomes an emergency. A farm can receive compensation and transition assistance if conservation is organized before planting. A sudden cut after commitments are made can become bankruptcy. A power agency can replace hydropower if it has time to contract for generation and strengthen transmission. An abrupt loss during extreme heat can become a grid reliability problem. A tribal water project can be integrated into long-term planning if funding and infrastructure are included from the beginning. Delaying that work can lock historical exclusion into the next operating system. Time changes not only the cost of adaptation, but also who is capable of adapting. Wealthy cities can finance engineering projects and secure alternative supplies. Smaller communities may depend on one intake, one treatment plant, one groundwater basin, or one federal grant cycle. Large agricultural operations may spread risk across multiple locations. A family farm may have one season. The longer the basin waits to align its water use with the water actually arriving, the more likely future reductions will be sudden, unequal, and governed by crisis rather than design. August therefore represents two overlapping thresholds. The first is physical. The moment updated projections reveal how close Lake Powell and Lake Mead may move toward dangerous operating elevations. The second is institutional. The moment the basin must confront whether emergency actions are merely protecting the current year or quietly becoming the operating model for the future. The river does not need to reach dead pool for the rules to fail. The rules begin failing when they require repeated exceptions, transfers, emergency releases, reduced deliveries, and last-minute negotiations, simply to preserve basic functions. The system can still be managed. The reservoirs still contain enormous volumes of water. Conservation has already demonstrated that cities and farms can reduce demand. Engineering can protect critical intakes and improve efficiency. Agreements can distribute risk more deliberately. But those tools all require the same disappearing resource: time. The most dangerous decline may not be measured on the walls of Lake Powell or Lake Mead. It may be measured in the narrowing interval between recognizing the next problem and being forced to act on it. The Colorado River is not only losing water, it is losing the luxury of waiting. The mechanism driving this emergency can be described as a hydrologic deficit cascade, a chain in which every stage of the water cycle passes less water to the next stage, while demanding more from the reserves below it. It begins high in the Rocky Mountains, long before Lake Powell or Lake Mead enters the picture. Much of the Colorado River's usable flow begins as mountain snow. Snow is not merely frozen precipitation, it is the basin's natural reservoir, storing winter moisture at high elevation and releasing it gradually during spring and early summer. In a cooler climate, deep snow remains in place for months, reflects a large share of incoming sunlight, and melts when farms, rivers, reservoirs, and ecosystems are preparing to use the resulting water. Warming alters all three functions. More winter precipitation can fall as rain instead of snow at lower and middle elevations. Snow can begin melting earlier. Bare ground exposed by early melt absorbs more solar energy than bright snow, causing additional heating and evaporation. The snowpack may still look substantial on a mountain map, but the amount of that water that eventually reaches a reservoir can be far smaller than expected. The first loss occurs before the river is even visible, then the cascade enters the soil. When previous seasons have been hot and dry, mountain soils begin the snowmelt period with a moisture debt. They behave like a dry sponge placed beneath a leaking pipe. The first water does not run across the surface toward a stream. It is absorbed. Some of that moisture restores the soil. Some is taken up by roots. Some returns to the atmosphere through evaporation and plant transpiration, the process through which vegetation releases water vapor. Together, evaporation and transpiration are called evapotranspiration. The term sounds technical, but the effect is simple. Water that might once have traveled downhill toward the Colorado River instead moves upward into the air. This is why snowpack alone cannot determine the final water supply. 2 winters can leave similar amounts of snow in the mountains, yet produce very different runoff if one spring begins with wetter soils and cooler air, while the other begins with dry ground, early warmth, and thirsty vegetation. Runoff efficiency describes how much precipitation becomes river flow. Under warmer and drier conditions, that efficiency declines. The watershed may receive water, but it delivers a smaller percentage of it to the channel. Research has estimated that long-term warming has played a major role in declining Colorado River streamflow by reducing snow cover and increasing evapotranspiration. One widely cited analysis found that average upper basin flow can fall by roughly 5% for every degree Fahrenheit of warming. That estimate does not mean every year will decline in a perfectly straight line. Precipitation remains the largest source of year-to-year variation, and wet years can still occur. It means the same storm, the same snow depth, or the same seasonal precipitation can produce less river water in a warmer basin than it would have produced under cooler conditions. Heat changes the conversion rate. This is the hidden machinery behind aridification. Drought usually describes a temporary shortage of precipitation compared with what is normal for a region. Aridification describes a longer shift toward drier conditions, driven partly by rising temperature and persistent moisture loss. During a drought, the central expectation is recovery when rain and snow return. During aridification, precipitation can return without restoring the old water balance because hotter air, earlier melt, drier soils, and greater plant demand continue removing water from the system. The basin is not simply waiting for the weather to become normal again. The definition of normal is moving. Once diminished runoff reaches the river, the next stage of the cascade begins. Tributaries carry less water toward Lake Powell, while legal commitments, irrigation demand, municipal use, environmental requirements, and downstream releases continue. The reservoir fills more slowly or continues falling. As its surface area remains exposed to hot, dry air, water evaporates directly from the lake. Reservoir evaporation is not the largest force in the entire basin, but it becomes more painful when every acre-foot is already contested. The remaining water must perform several jobs at once. It must support releases downstream. It must preserve hydropower. It must maintain enough pressure against the dam for turbines to operate. It must protect water quality, recreation, habitat, and access. It must provide insurance against the next dry year. A falling reservoir therefore loses more than volume. It loses options. Glen Canyon Dam illustrates how the cascade becomes mechanical. Hydropower depends on hydraulic head, the vertical distance between the reservoir surface and the turbines. Water descending through that height carries potential energy. As the reservoir falls, the vertical distance shrinks, reducing the pressure and power available to generate electricity. Turbines can still operate, but they produce less energy and face a narrowing range of safe conditions. Near minimum power pool, normal generation becomes severely constrained. Below that threshold, managers may need to move water through lower outlet structures rather than the turbines. A climatic signal that began as warmer air over mountain snow has now entered steel penstocks, turbine blades, electrical contracts, and the Western power grid. The mechanism has crossed from atmosphere into infrastructure. From the grid, it passes into human vulnerability. Hydropower from Glen Canyon and Hoover dams does not supply every home in the West, and losing part of that generation would not automatically cause a regional blackout. Its importance lies in flexibility. Hydroelectric output can be adjusted quickly, making it useful when electricity demand rises during extreme heat or when wind and solar generation fluctuate. If reservoir levels reduce that flexible capacity, utilities may need to replace it with electricity purchased elsewhere, generated from other fuels, or transmitted across already busy lines. costs can rise. Grid operators lose a controllable resource. During the hottest hours, when air conditioning demand is highest, the system has less room to respond. Heat has therefore attacked the river twice, first by reducing runoff, then by increasing the demand for electricity that declining hydropower helps support. The same cascade passes through agriculture. When river deliveries are reduced, a farmer does not experience the shortage as an abstract percentage. It enters through a canal gate. Less water reaches the field, or the price of obtaining it increases. The farmer may pump more groundwater, if a well exists, and if the aquifer can support additional withdrawals. Pumping requires electricity, which raises costs precisely when power systems may also be under heat stress. If groundwater is too deep, too saline, legally restricted, or physically unavailable, the farmer may plant fewer acres or select crops with lower water demand. But crops cannot always be exchanged, like parts in a machine. Orchards and vineyards are permanent investments. Livestock operations need forage. Vegetable producers are tied to contracts, labor, equipment, markets, and planting windows. A reduction at the reservoir moves into the soil of an individual field, from the field into crop yield, from yield into income, from income into wages and local businesses, and eventually from production into food prices. The water shortage is no longer located behind a dam. It has entered a household budget. Cities encounter the mechanism differently. Many large metropolitan areas have reduced per-person water use, expanded conservation, removed ornamental grass, recycled indoor water, and invested in backup infrastructure. Those actions matter because they slow the cascade. Yet conservation does not eliminate physical dependence. A city still needs functioning intakes, treatment plants, pumping stations, electricity, distribution pipes, and sufficient reservoir elevation to move water through the system. Las Vegas offers a clear example of adaptation. Because most indoor water is treated and returned to Lake Mead, indoor conservation and recycling preserve much of the supply. Outdoor water used on lawns and landscaping is more likely to be lost through evaporation. The city has therefore focused heavily on reducing non-functional grass and outdoor demand. But even an efficient city cannot recycle water that never reaches its intake. Infrastructure can extend the usable range of a reservoir, not refill it. Tribal communities may experience the cascade through an even more fundamental weakness. A nation can possess a legal right to water while lacking the pipelines, treatment facilities, pumps, storage tanks, or financing needed to put that right to use. When basin managers measure existing consumption, communities that were historically denied infrastructure may appear to use little water. That low use can then be mistaken for low need. Scarcity moves through law as well as hydrology. It can preserve the advantage of users who developed large diversion systems earlier, while requiring communities without comparable infrastructure to wait again. The physical cascade therefore merges with a social one, from limited infrastructure to limited use, from limited use to weak representation in existing records, and from weak representation to greater vulnerability when new reductions are negotiated. The central image is not a river simply drying from one end to the other. It is a series of narrowing doors. Snow must pass through the door of temperature. Meltwater must pass through the door of dry soil. Runoff must pass through the door of vegetation and evaporation. River flow must pass through reservoirs, dams, laws, canals, pumps, power systems, and contracts. At each door, part of the water is lost, delayed, claimed, or redirected. By the time the remaining supply reaches a field, a city, an ecosystem, or a household, it carries the accumulated pressure of every earlier stage. That is why one wet storm cannot reverse the emergency, and one wet winter may not be enough. A large snowpack can improve conditions dramatically, but recovery depends on when the snow melts, how dry the soil is, how warm the spring becomes, how much water reaches the channels, how reservoirs are operated, and how much demand is reduced. The mechanism has memory. Dry soils remember previous heat. Low reservoirs remember previous deficits. Groundwater basins remember previous pumping. Infrastructure remembers deferred maintenance. communities remember earlier cuts. Every year begins with the consequences of the years before it. The hydrologic deficit cascade is therefore not a single failure. It is a process that converts atmospheric heat into shrinking snow cover into weaker runoff into falling storage into reduced hydropower and tighter deliveries into economic and social stress. It moves from the sky into the ground, from the ground into the river into machines, and from machines into human lives. Emergency releases and conservation can interrupt parts of the chain. Better forecasts, stronger agreements, efficient irrigation, water recycling, groundwater protection, and redesigned reservoir rules can reduce the damage. But no policy can repeal the mechanism itself. When the basin becomes warmer, more water is required merely to produce the same amount of flow. When less flow reaches the reservoirs, every promise written against that water becomes harder to keep. The Colorado River emergency is not being caused by one empty lake. It is being built upstream, one lost fraction at a time. Long before the Colorado River entered its present emergency, history had already been leaving warnings across the American West. The problem was that each warning appeared temporary when viewed alone. A severe drought ended with a wet winter. A low reservoir recovered after several strong runoff seasons. A difficult negotiation produced another agreement that bought additional time. Each individual crisis seemed survivable. Only when those events are placed together does a different picture emerge. They no longer resemble isolated disasters. They resemble chapters of the same story, each revealing another limit of a river system designed for a climate that no longer behaves as consistently as it once did. One of the earliest lessons arrived during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Although the Dust Bowl occurred primarily across the Great Plains rather than the Colorado River Basin itself, it permanently changed how the United States understood the relationship between climate, land management, and water. Years of drought, combined with exposed soils and powerful winds, transformed productive farmland into massive dust storms that darkened skies hundreds of miles away. Entire communities lost crops, livestock, income, and eventually their homes. More than 2 million people migrated from the plains during that decade. Engineers, politicians, and water planners drew one major conclusion from that catastrophe. The nation needed larger and more reliable water infrastructure capable of storing wet years for use during dry ones. The great dam-building era that followed reflected that belief. Hoover Dam, completed during the early 1930s, became more than an engineering achievement. It represented confidence that human planning could overcome climatic uncertainty. Glen Canyon Dam followed decades later with a similar purpose. Together, Lake Mead and Lake Powell became the largest water savings account in the United States. The assumption behind both reservoirs was straightforward. The river would always experience wet and dry years, but over long periods the average supply would remain close enough to historical conditions that storage could smooth the differences. That assumption was supported by 20th century observations, but later scientific research began questioning whether the 20th century itself had been unusually wet compared with the much longer history of the basin. Tree ring studies transformed that understanding. Instead of relying only on stream gauges that covered roughly a century, researchers examined annual growth rings preserved inside ancient trees across the southwest. Wide rings indicated relatively favorable growing conditions. Narrow rings reflected years of moisture stress. By combining thousands of overlapping samples, scientists reconstructed Colorado River flow centuries before modern measurements existed. The results changed the conversation. The historical record captured by gauges represented only a small fraction of the basin's natural variability. Long before modern cities existed, the Southwest had experienced droughts lasting decades rather than years. Some of those so-called megadroughts were considerably more severe than anything observed during the 20th century. The river had always possessed the capacity for prolonged shortages. Modern infrastructure had simply been designed during an unusually favorable chapter of that much longer history. Then came the early years of the 21st century. Beginning around the year 2000, the Colorado River Basin entered one of the driest extended periods in the instrumental record. Snowpack declined repeatedly, temperatures increased, reservoir levels began falling despite the existence of enormous storage capacity. At first, many expected the next sequence of wet winters to restore the system. Some improvement did occur during individual years, but the long-term trajectory continued downward. Scientists increasingly described the event not merely as another drought but as a megadrought, the driest 22-year period in at least 12 centuries, according to several major paleoclimate studies. The significance of that conclusion was profound. It suggested that the basin was experiencing conditions rivaling some of the most severe natural droughts in more than 1,000 years, while simultaneously supporting a population and agricultural economy far larger than anything that had previously existed. History and modern demand had collided. During those same decades, another pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. Higher temperatures appeared to intensify the effects of reduced precipitation. Researchers from institutions including the United States Geological Survey, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and several leading universities documented that warming alone could reduce Colorado River flow by increasing evapotranspiration and lowering runoff efficiency. This finding explained why years with respectable snowfall sometimes produced disappointing reservoir inflows. The mountains were still receiving moisture, but the watershed itself was consuming more of it before it reached the river. The atmosphere had become a larger competitor for every snowflake that landed. Lake Mead quietly recorded this new reality. The reservoir reached full capacity during the 1980s and remained relatively healthy through much of the 1990s. Then the decline began. Year after year, shoreline rock, once hidden beneath deep water, became visible. Boat ramps had to be extended. Marinas were relocated. Intake structures that had once rested comfortably underwater approached critical elevations. The famous white mineral deposits surrounding the lake, often called the bathtub ring, continued climbing higher above the surface. That pale band became one of the most recognizable visual symbols of long-term water loss in North America. It did not appear after one catastrophic season. It accumulated year after year as the reservoir slowly surrendered elevation. Lake Powell followed a similar path. During wetter periods, its sandstone canyons filled with deep blue water stretching across hundreds of miles. During prolonged shortages, side canyons narrowed, boat access changed, sediment became more visible, and familiar shorelines retreated. Recreation businesses adapted repeatedly, but each adaptation reflected another step away from the conditions for which the infrastructure had originally been designed. Floating docks were moved, launch ramps were lengthened, navigation maps changed. What visitors often interpreted as temporary inconvenience was, for reservoir managers, evidence that operational assumptions were steadily shifting. Then history delivered another unmistakable warning. In the summer of 2022, Lake Powell approached elevations uncomfortably close to minimum power pool. Federal officials responded with emergency releases from Flaming Gorge Reservoir and other upstream facilities to protect Glen Canyon Dam's ability to generate electricity. Those emergency actions were unprecedented in modern Colorado River management. For the first time, one major reservoir was deliberately sacrificing part of its own storage to prevent another reservoir from crossing a critical infrastructure threshold. The intervention succeeded in preserving operational flexibility, but it also demonstrated that the traditional reservoir hierarchy was changing. The emergency reserve itself had begun requiring emergency support. That event established an important precedent. Emergency operations were no longer theoretical contingency plans stored inside planning documents. They had become real management tools. Every subsequent year would therefore be evaluated against a new question. Could the system avoid repeating extraordinary measures, or had extraordinary measures become part of ordinary operations? The answer has become increasingly complicated. The winter of 2022 into 2023 brought remarkable snowfall across parts of the Rocky Mountains. Headlines celebrated the possibility that the Colorado River had finally been rescued. Reservoir levels did improve. Lake Powell rose substantially compared with its previous lows. Lake Mead also gained elevation, yet federal managers consistently warned that one excellent snow year could not erase decades of accumulated deficit. The reservoirs remained far below full capacity. Groundwater depletion continued in many areas. Long-term average temperatures remained elevated. The improved runoff bought valuable time, but did not restore the historical safety margin. The optimism generated by one winter illustrated another lesson from history. Human perception naturally focuses on dramatic recovery, while hydrologic systems remember cumulative loss. One wet season creates visible change because water rises quickly along exposed canyon walls. Rebuilding tens of millions of acre-feet of storage, however, requires repeated favorable years combined with sustained conservation. Recovery is measured over decades, not headlines. Scientific literature increasingly reinforced that conclusion. Multiple peer-reviewed studies published over the past decade concluded that anthropogenic warming had significantly increased the severity of the current megadrought. Researchers emphasized that declining precipitation alone could not explain the magnitude of streamflow reduction. Rising temperatures amplified moisture loss across the basin, making dry periods drier than they would have been under 20th century climate conditions. Importantly, these studies did not argue that every drought is caused by climate change. Natural climate variability remains an essential driver of Western hydrology. Instead, they demonstrated that warming acts as a multiplier, increasing the probability that naturally dry periods evolve into exceptionally severe water shortages. That distinction matters because it separates evidence from exaggeration. The historical record supports neither complacency nor fatalism. It supports preparation. Another important comparison comes from outside the Colorado Basin itself. During California's prolonged drought between 2012 and 2016, extensive groundwater pumping temporarily compensated for reduced surface supplies. Farms continued operating in many regions because wells reached deeper into underground aquifers, yet satellite observations later revealed substantial groundwater depletion. The apparent solution had quietly transferred risk into the future. Water withdrawn from ancient aquifers may require decades or centuries to recharge. The lesson applies directly to the Colorado River. Groundwater can cushion temporary shortages, but treating underground reserves as an unlimited replacement for declining river flow eventually creates another deficit that future generations must inherit. International experience offers similar warnings. The Aral Sea in Central Asia, once among the world's largest inland lakes, shrank dramatically after decades of river diversion for irrigation. Although the Colorado River Basin differs greatly in geography, governance, and engineering, both systems demonstrate the cumulative consequences of allocating more water than long-term supply can consistently support. Neither collapse occurred overnight. Both emerged gradually through thousands of individually rational decisions that collectively exceeded environmental limits. History rarely repeats with identical details, but it often repeats through familiar mechanisms. Every generation inherits the belief that current conditions are close to normal because they are the conditions people have known throughout their own lives. Scientists call this shifting baseline syndrome. Each generation unconsciously accepts a degraded state as the new reference point, because memories rarely extend beyond living experience. A child visiting Lake Mead today may consider its present shoreline completely ordinary. Someone who saw the reservoir near full capacity decades earlier recognizes that the landscape has fundamentally changed. Managers face the same psychological challenge. Emergency operations that once appeared extraordinary gradually become accepted practice if they continue long enough. Reservoir transfers become normal. Conservation becomes permanent. Lower operating targets become expected. The baseline shifts again. That may be the most important historical lesson of all. The Colorado River has repeatedly demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to survive. Its reservoirs have recovered after difficult years. States have negotiated major agreements despite deep disagreements. Cities have dramatically reduced per capita water use. Farmers have improved irrigation efficiency. Tribal nations have secured important legal victories. None of those achievements should be dismissed. They prove that adaptation is possible. But history also demonstrates that every recovery has occurred within an environment that continued changing beneath the surface. Each crisis solved one immediate problem while revealing a deeper structural question. The emergency now unfolding, therefore, should not be viewed as the beginning of an unprecedented disaster, nor as the final chapter of inevitable decline. It belongs to a much longer continuum, stretching from ancient megadroughts recorded inside tree rings, through the Dust Bowl, through the construction of the great reservoirs, through the shortages of the early 21st century, and into the present moment. The pattern is unmistakable. The Colorado River has warned repeatedly that supply cannot be understood through one wet year, one dry year, or one dramatic headline. It must be understood across generations. Every historical comparison points toward the same conclusion. The river has always tested human societies. What has changed is the number of people depending upon it, the amount of infrastructure connected to it, the amount of water already promised from it, and the speed at which a warming climate can magnify natural variability. That combination has no exact historical precedent. The past does not predict the future with certainty. It does something more valuable. It reveals that every major turning point in the Colorado River Basin first appeared as a warning that many people believed would pass. The Colorado River emergency becomes most dangerous, where a large system depends on a small component that cannot fail gracefully. A reservoir may contain millions of acre-feet, but a community can still lose access because one intake sits too high above the falling water. A regional power network may serve millions, but one transformer can become the point where extreme heat, reduced hydropower, and rising demand converge. A city may possess a legal water allocation, but that right becomes useless if pumps cannot lift water through a canal. The vulnerability of the basin is therefore not located only in Lake Powell or Lake Mead. It is distributed through thousands of physical bottlenecks, legal priorities, financial limits, and human dependencies. The weakest of those links will determine who experiences the shortage first. At Glen Canyon Dam, the vulnerable component is the shrinking column of water above the turbines. The dam was designed to convert the weight and movement of stored water into electricity. As Lake Powell falls, hydraulic pressure declines, generation becomes less efficient, and operators lose room to respond to changing conditions. The entire structure does not need to fail for the consequences to spread. A reduced power output is enough. Electricity customers may face higher replacement costs. Grid operators may lose a flexible source of generation during high-demand periods. Water managers may have fewer safe release options. A problem measured in vertical feet behind one dam can move across transmission lines into utilities, municipal budgets, and households hundreds of miles away. At Hoover Dam, the same basic weakness appears downstream. Less water arriving from Lake Powell can accelerate the decline of Lake Mead, reducing the hydraulic head that drives Hoover's turbines. The immediate danger is not that the lights suddenly go out across the southwest. The grid is larger and more diverse than one dam. The deeper risk is that a valuable shock absorber becomes weaker during the exact season when extreme heat pushes electricity demand toward its highest levels. Hydropower can respond quickly when other generators fail or when demand rises unexpectedly. Replacing that flexibility requires fuel, contracts, transmission capacity, and available generation somewhere else. If several parts of the power system are stressed at once, the loss of one flexible source matters far more than its percentage of total generation suggests. The smallest failure point may therefore be a turbine, a transmission constraint, or a transformer operating near its thermal limit. Water and electricity are also physically connected through pumping. The Central Arizona project does not allow Colorado River water to flow naturally toward Phoenix and Tucson. It lifts that water thousands of feet across the desert through a chain of pumping plants. Those pumps require enormous amounts of electricity. If power costs rise while water deliveries fall, the system faces pressure from both directions. Less water is available, and the water that remains becomes more expensive to move. Municipal utilities may absorb part of the increase, but higher costs eventually enter water rates, public budgets, or delayed infrastructure maintenance. A large city can often spread those costs across a broad customer base. A smaller district cannot. One failed pump, one delayed repair, or one unaffordable energy bill can create a local crisis even while the wider system remains operational. Agricultural communities usually encounter the shortage earlier because many hold lower priority rights or participate in conservation programs that reduce deliveries before urban taps are affected. The vulnerable component is often the irrigation schedule. A farm does not need to lose all of its water to become economically unstable. A delivery arriving too late can miss a planting window. A smaller allocation can force a field to remain fallow. A sudden reduction can arrive after seed, fertilizer, labor, fuel, and equipment have already been purchased. The weakness is temporal as much as physical. Water delivered after the critical growth stage cannot recover a lost crop. From the canal, the shortage enters the field. From the field, it enters yield. From yield, it enters farm income, worker hours, equipment payments, local tax revenue, and the survival of nearby businesses. A reservoir decline that appears gradual from space can produce an abrupt economic break in one rural town. Groundwater often becomes the emergency substitute, but that substitute has its own weak links. Some farms can pump deeper. Others cannot afford the energy, lack access to a viable aquifer, or face wells that produce increasingly saline water. Heavy pumping can lower water tables, causing shallow domestic wells to fail before large agricultural wells stop operating. The first household to lose water may therefore not be in a major city. It may be a rural family whose well was drilled decades ago to a depth that once seemed sufficient. A neighboring industrial or agricultural user may continue pumping from a deeper well, while that household begins hauling water. The basin can still report millions of acre-feet in storage, while a kitchen faucet produces nothing. That is how systemic scarcity becomes personal. Tribal nations face some of the most severe examples of infrastructure vulnerability. Many possess substantial legal claims or recognized rights to Colorado River water, yet rights alone do not build pipelines, treatment plants, storage tanks, or household connections. A community may live close to a major river or reservoir and still rely on hauled water. In that setting, the fragile component may be a truck, a community well, a pump, or a small treatment facility operating with limited funding and few replacement parts. When drought lowers local groundwater or raises operating costs, there may be no redundant system waiting behind it. Historical underinvestment transforms a basin-wide shortage into a much sharper local emergency. The danger is not only unequal water allocation, it is unequal capacity to survive interruption. Urban systems are generally more resilient, but their resilience also depends on specific pieces of infrastructure. Las Vegas invested in a low-level pumping station capable of drawing water from Lake Mead, even if the reservoir falls below the elevation of older intakes. That project greatly reduced the immediate risk of losing access. Yet the existence of such infrastructure reveals the scale of adaptation required. Not every city can spend billions of dollars to redesign its connection to a shrinking reservoir. Smaller communities around the basin may depend on one surface intake, one treatment plant, or one narrow pipeline. If water quality changes as reservoirs decline, treatment becomes more difficult. Warmer water can support biological growth. Sediment and mineral concentrations can shift. A system designed for one range of conditions may require new equipment to handle another. The breaking point may not be water quantity alone. It may be the ability to make the remaining water safe. Recreation economies are tied to equally small physical thresholds. A marina can operate while the reservoir falls, but only as long as docks can be moved, fuel systems remain accessible, and boat ramps reach the water. A launch ramp, ending above the shoreline, can remove an entire access point. Visitor traffic declines. Seasonal workers lose hours. Restaurants, hotels, rental companies, repair shops, and county revenues feel the effect. These losses are sometimes dismissed as secondary compared with drinking water and agriculture. But in communities built around Lake Powell, Lake Mead, or Flaming Gorge, recreation is the local economy. A change of several vertical feet can decide whether businesses survive another season. Ecosystems possess their own hidden bottlenecks. Fish may depend on a narrow range of water temperature, dissolved oxygen, and seasonal flow timing. Reduced releases can warm downstream habitat or alter sediment movement. Native species adapted to historical river patterns already compete with invasive species and fragmented habitat. A single hot season can push a stressed population past a biological threshold. Wetlands in the Colorado River Delta depend on carefully managed flows that are small compared with agricultural and urban deliveries. Because those environmental releases are limited, they can be vulnerable when every acre-foot is contested. The weakest component may be one spawning reach, one cold water refuge, or one seasonal pulse that fails to arrive. Hospitals reveal how water stress can merge with heat and power stress. Medical facilities require continuous electricity for cooling, ventilation, imaging, refrigeration, dialysis, and emergency equipment. They also require reliable water for sanitation, sterilization, cooling systems, kitchens, and patient care. During extreme heat, emergency visits increase as dehydration, cardiovascular stress, kidney problems, and heat illness rise. At the same time, electricity demand peaks and water systems operate under greater pressure. A hospital may have backup generators, but generators depend on fuel, maintenance, and cooling. The vulnerable component may be a transfer switch, a fuel delivery, or an aging chiller. When water and power systems weaken together, the institution responsible for absorbing human suffering becomes part of the same stressed network. Food supply chains extend the basin's vulnerability far beyond the Southwest. Colorado River agriculture produces crops during seasons when colder regions cannot. Reductions in irrigated acreage can affect produce availability, livestock feed, processing facilities, trucking schedules, and retail prices. The fragile point may not be the total amount of food produced. It may be the timing of one harvest or the loss of one regional supplier during a season with few alternatives. Wealthier consumers may absorb higher prices. Low-income households cannot. A shortage that begins as reduced river flow can eventually appear as fewer fresh foods in a family's shopping cart. This is why the emergency is more dangerous than any headline percentage. Percentages describe average conditions across a vast basin. People live at specific failure points. One community has a deep intake, another has a shallow well. One farm can purchase supplemental water, another cannot survive a single missed season. One utility can replace hydropower through a diversified portfolio. Another faces sudden costs it must pass directly to customers. The same reservoir elevation produces radically different consequences depending on infrastructure, income, legal priority, and access to alternatives. The Colorado River system is not a single machine with one emergency switch. It is a chain of machines, communities, and agreements, each with a different tolerance for stress. The first break will not necessarily occur where the reservoir is lowest. It will occur where the margin is smallest. It may be a canal gate, a pump, a turbine, a rural well, a treatment unit, a transmission line, a hospital cooling system, or a planting deadline. That small component will translate basin-wide scarcity into a local emergency. Once it fails, the crisis will no longer be measured in acre-feet. It will be measured in lost income, higher bills, interrupted care, abandoned fields, closed businesses, and households waiting for water that the wider system still claims to possess. The Colorado River emergency exposes a problem larger than 2 reservoirs, 7 states, or one difficult summer. It reveals that the American West is attempting to operate a 20th century water system inside a 21st century climate, while using institutions that were built to assume the past would remain a reliable guide. The dams, canals, allocation laws, agricultural districts, municipal growth plans, electrical contracts, and emergency procedures of the basin were created around a central expectation. Dry periods would occur, but the river would eventually return toward a familiar average. Storage would carry society through drought, snowmelt would refill the system, and temporary shortages would remain temporary. That expectation is now under pressure because the river is not simply experiencing another dry interval. It is being reshaped by aridification, a long-term transition toward a warmer and more water-limited environment. Drought is an event inside a climate. Aridification is a change in the climate that defines what drought means. In an ordinary drought, rain and snow decline for a period, reservoirs fall, and recovery begins when precipitation returns. Under aridification, rising temperature increases evaporation, dries soils, reduces snow cover, shifts runoff earlier, and causes vegetation to consume more moisture. A wet winter may still raise reservoirs, sometimes dramatically, but the same amount of precipitation produces less usable river flow than it would have under cooler conditions. The basin can receive an impressive snowpack and still recover less efficiently because the landscape between the mountains and the reservoirs has become a larger consumer of water. This is why the phrase "new baseline" matters. It does not mean every future year will be dry, or that Lake Powell and Lake Mead can never rise again. Climate variability will continue producing wet winters, strong storms, and periods of relief. The new baseline is the background condition against which those events occur. A wet year now arrives in a hotter watershed. A dry year arrives in a hotter watershed. Both are affected by greater atmospheric demand for moisture. United States Geological Survey research has estimated that Upper Colorado River Basin streamflow has declined by about 5% for every degree Fahrenheit of warming, largely because reduced snow cover exposes darker ground that absorbs more solar energy and increases evaporation. Over the last century, the naturalized flow of the upper basin has declined by roughly 1/5. Those figures do not establish a precise forecast for every future year, but they demonstrate that temperature is no longer a secondary influence added to precipitation. It is becoming one of the forces that determines how much precipitation becomes water available for people and ecosystems. The system's original operating logic was built around river flow, measured during a relatively short historical period. That logic treated major reservoirs as buffers against variability. The emerging reality is that the buffers themselves are being consumed by a directional change. If the long-term average supply continues falling while allocations, infrastructure, and economic expectations remain fixed, emergency measures will recur more frequently. Water transfers from upstream reservoirs, reduced releases between Powell and Mead, temporary conservation payments, shortage declarations, and last-minute agreements may stop appearing as exceptional interventions. They may become the ordinary tools required to hold the system together. That transformation is already visible in federal planning. The Bureau of Reclamation's post-2026 process is not merely replacing an expired instruction manual. It is attempting to design operating rules that can function across a much wider range of possible hydrologic futures, including conditions lower than those around which earlier agreements were built. The draft environmental review released in early 2026 examines alternatives for the future operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and the management actions connected to them. Reclamation received more than 18,000 public submissions during the review period. That number reflects more than public interest. It reflects the enormous number of people, governments, industries, ecosystems, and legal claims attached to each operating decision. Any new framework must determine what happens when storage is high, when storage is low, and when both reservoirs approach elevations at which the old release logic no longer functions. It must decide whether reductions are triggered by reservoir elevation, total system storage, measured inflow, recent use, legal priority, or some combination of those factors. It must consider how upper basin and lower basin risks are shared, how Mexico is included, how tribal nations participate, how environmental requirements are protected, and how emergency authority is used when forecasts deteriorate faster than formal negotiations can respond. That is not simply water management. It is the redesign of a regional operating system. The danger is that the physical system may change faster than the political system can complete that redesign. Infrastructure is built on long timelines. A major recycling facility, canal modification, desalination project, pumping station, or new reservoir connection may take many years to plan, permit, finance, and construct. Climate pressure advances every season. Reservoir elevation can decline within months. Agricultural planting decisions occur within weeks. Heat waves stress the grid within hours. The mismatch between those timescales can overload institutions, even when no single physical component has failed. Agencies must manage today's emergency, negotiate tomorrow's rules, finance new infrastructure, protect endangered species, respond to lawsuits, coordinate with dozens of sovereign governments, and explain uncertainty to a public that often demands a simple answer. The system can become administratively overloaded before it becomes physically empty. This is one reason the Colorado River crisis should concern regions far beyond the Southwest. Many modern systems were designed using historical averages that climate change is now destabilizing. Storm drains were sized for rainfall statistics that may underestimate present cloudbursts. Electrical grids were planned around heat patterns that may no longer describe peak demand. Reservoirs were operated according to snowmelt timing that is shifting earlier. Agricultural calendars were shaped by frost dates, soil moisture, and irrigation reliability that are becoming less predictable. Insurance markets were built around probabilities that change after repeated fires, floods, and storms. The Colorado River is an especially visible example because its reservoirs display accumulated stress on canyon walls, but the underlying problem is global. Infrastructure is being forced to operate outside the range of conditions for which it was optimized. When that happens, a system does not always collapse dramatically. More often, it becomes less efficient, more expensive, and increasingly dependent on emergency exceptions. The first sign of a new baseline is often not total failure. It is the disappearance of normal operations. The Colorado Basin is already showing that pattern. Cities have made conservation permanent rather than temporary. Farmers are being paid to leave land unplanted. Reservoir releases are being modified to protect critical elevations. Upstream storage is being used to support downstream infrastructure. Hydropower planning must account for lower generating capacity. Negotiators are debating rules that may need to function under conditions once treated as remote extremes. Each response is rational. Together, they reveal that the old baseline has weakened. The question is whether the new baseline will be defined deliberately through adaptation or imposed through repeated crisis. Deliberate adaptation would mean using less water before reservoirs reach emergency thresholds, not after. It would mean rewarding conservation without destroying agricultural communities. Investing in efficiency without pretending efficiency can create unlimited supply, and recognizing that some existing uses may have to change permanently. It would mean building tribal water infrastructure, rather than treating historically suppressed use as evidence of low demand. It would mean connecting groundwater and surface water management, because pumping from aquifers can reduce future stream flow and transfer present shortages into the future. It would mean protecting electricity, food, ecosystems, and public health as connected systems rather than separate policy categories. Most importantly, it would mean designing rules around uncertainty instead of requiring the river to match one forecast. A resilient system does not depend on predicting the exact flow decades ahead. It establishes actions that become stronger as conditions worsen and that preserve critical functions across many possible futures. Yet adaptation also has limits. Conservation can reduce demand, but every efficiency measure eventually approaches a physical boundary. Cities can recycle indoor water, but outdoor losses and population growth still matter. Farmers can change irrigation methods, but crops require water to grow. Reservoir operators can move water between storage facilities, but transfers do not increase the total supply. Engineers can lower intakes, but deeper pumps do not refill a lake. The belief that technology alone can preserve every existing pattern of use is another version of the old baseline. It assumes that infrastructure can always outrun hydrology. The Colorado River is demonstrating that infrastructure can extend time, redistribute risk, and protect essential services, but it cannot manufacture the snowmelt that no longer reaches the channel. This does not mean the region has no future. The basin contains some of the most experienced water managers, engineers, agricultural producers, scientists, and conservation programs in the world. Major cities have supported population growth while reducing per-person water consumption. Flexible agreements have conserved significant volumes. Forecasting and measurement continue improving. New operating rules can reduce the risk of catastrophic reservoir decline. But success will require a change in the definition of stability. Stability can no longer mean restoring every reservoir, delivery, and land use pattern to the conditions remembered from the late 20th century. It must mean maintaining essential functions, while total use adjusts to a smaller and more variable supply. That is the system-level message of the emergency. Lake Powell is not simply low. Lake Mead is not simply receiving less water. The river is testing whether a society can revise its expectations before physical thresholds revise them instead. The new baseline is not one permanent reservoir elevation or one exact flow number. It is a condition in which heat has become part of every water calculation. Emergency margins are thinner. Wet years cannot be mistaken for complete recovery, and decisions delayed today return later with fewer options. The crisis is therefore moving beyond drought management. It is becoming a question of whether laws, infrastructure, and human expectations can change at the speed of the climate that now surrounds them. Before drawing the largest conclusion from the Colorado River emergency, the evidence must be separated from the assumptions surrounding it. The first fact is clear. The river is under severe stress because natural supply, reservoir storage, and human demand are no longer aligned. Rising temperatures are reducing runoff efficiency. Prolonged drought has depleted storage, and water use remains large enough that managers must transfer risk between reservoirs to protect critical infrastructure. These forces are connected, but connection does not mean that every alarming event in the basin has the same cause, and it does not mean that every feared consequence is inevitable. The emergency is real, precisely because the evidence is strong enough without exaggeration. Climate change is related to the crisis, but it is not the only force acting on the river. Natural variability still determines much of the difference between one year and the next. The Pacific Ocean, atmospheric circulation, storm tracks, and winter precipitation can produce exceptionally wet years or exceptionally dry years. Scientists cannot look at one weak snow season and claim that climate change directly caused every missing storm. They can examine the long record and determine that warming has changed the background conditions under which those storms occur. Higher temperatures increase evaporation, reduce snow cover, accelerate snowmelt, and allow soils and vegetation to consume more moisture. The result is that a naturally dry year can become more damaging, while a wet year may produce less runoff than the same precipitation would have produced in a cooler climate. Climate change is therefore not a switch that creates each individual drought. It is a force that loads the system toward greater water loss. The distinction is essential. It prevents a scientifically supported long-term trend from being confused with a precise explanation for every season. Precipitation remains the largest source of year-to-year uncertainty in Colorado River flow. Some research project substantial future declines as warming continues. Other studies suggest that increased upper basin precipitation could partially offset temperature-driven losses during certain periods. These findings are not proof that scientists understand nothing. They show that the direction of temperature is clear, while the future behavior of regional precipitation is less certain. The basin will become warmer. Exactly how much snow and rain it receives in any future decade remains more difficult to predict. That uncertainty widens the range of possible river flows. It does not restore the safety of assuming that 20th century averages will return. Another unsupported claim is that the Colorado River is about to disappear completely. It is not. Water will continue flowing through the basin, storms will continue arriving, and reservoirs may rise during favorable years. Dead pool, the elevation at which gravity can no longer move water through a dam's lowest outlets, is a serious planning scenario, but it is not a forecast that the reservoirs will inevitably reach that point during one particular summer. Minimum power pool is different from dead pool. A reservoir can lose normal hydropower generation while still holding and releasing substantial water. Confusing those thresholds creates unnecessary panic and hides the real warning. Infrastructure can lose important functions long before the reservoir becomes empty. The danger is not a cinematic moment when the entire river suddenly stops. It is the gradual loss of operating flexibility as water levels approach a sequence of mechanical thresholds. It is also misleading to claim that 40 million people are about to lose their household water simultaneously. The river supports municipal systems serving roughly that population, but those systems do not possess identical exposure. Cities have different legal priorities, conservation programs, groundwater supplies, recycling systems, reservoirs, and intake structures. Some can absorb reductions for years. Others have fewer alternatives. Urban taps are generally protected more strongly than lower priority agricultural deliveries. That does not make the crisis harmless. It means the first consequences are more likely to appear through reduced farming, higher pumping costs, declining hydropower, environmental damage, and greater pressure on vulnerable communities, rather than one sudden regional shutoff. Another claim requiring caution is that reservoir decline alone will produce widespread electrical blackouts. Lower Lake Powell and Lake Mead levels can reduce generation at Glen Canyon and Hoover dams, removing valuable, flexible power from the western grid. That loss can raise costs and reduce resilience during extreme heat. But hydropower from those dams represents only part of a much larger electrical system. A decline in generation does not automatically equal a blackout. The real risk emerges when reduced hydropower coincides with extreme demand, transmission constraints, generator failures, wildfire disruptions, or shortages elsewhere. The events are connected through system stress, but one does not guarantee the other. The same discipline must be applied to August. August matters because federal projections traditionally inform reservoir operations, release volumes, and shortage decisions. Updated forecasts can alter how managers understand the coming year. But August is not a mysterious deadline after which the river suddenly obeys new physical laws. The models will contain uncertainty. Negotiations will continue. Emergency actions may be revised as conditions change. The month matters because decisions become more concrete. Not because one forecast can perfectly predict the future. A projection is a range of plausible outcomes based on current information, not a promise from the atmosphere. The post-2026 operating process also needs careful interpretation. The release of draft alternatives does not mean one new rule has already been selected, and it does not guarantee that every dispute among the basin states, tribal nations, Mexico, cities, farms, and environmental interests has been resolved. Draft environmental review is designed to compare possible strategies and consequences before a final decision. More than 18,000 public submissions demonstrate the breadth of concern, but the number itself does not prove consensus. The real challenge is converting participation into rules that remain functional under conditions the basin may never have experienced in modern management. What is firmly supported is more serious than the speculation. The upper basin has warmed. Naturalized streamflow has declined over the long term. Research has linked part of that decline to warming-driven snow loss and increased evapotranspiration. Reservoir storage remains far below the levels that once gave the basin broad protection from consecutive dry years. Emergency transfers can protect one reservoir only by reducing reserves or inflows somewhere else. Legal rights do not guarantee physical water when total supply falls, and technical solutions cannot create runoff that never reaches the river. The basin therefore faces a genuine risk of repeated shortages, declining hydropower, agricultural disruption, ecosystem damage, and increasingly difficult political conflict. What remains uncertain is the exact sequence. No model can identify the precise winter when storage will recover. the precise summer when another threshold will be approached, or the precise agreement the states will ultimately accept. Uncertainty, however, should not be mistaken for safety. When a system has a wide range of possible futures, including several that produce severe consequences, resilience depends on preparing before the worst outcome becomes the most probable one. The responsible conclusion is neither that the river is doomed, nor that one wet winter will solve the problem. It is that warming has reduced the reliability of old assumptions, while human decisions still determine how the remaining risk is distributed. The climate influences how much water arrives. Laws and infrastructure determine who can reach it. Negotiations determine who must reduce use. Wealth determines who can adapt quickly. History determines who entered the emergency with strong rights and modern facilities, and who entered it waiting for pipes that were never built. Those are not speculative dangers. They are the architecture through which the next shortage will travel. The most credible warning is therefore also the most restrained. The Colorado River is not vanishing tomorrow. It is becoming less forgiving today. The emergency began with a number large enough to sound like rescue, as much as 2.48 million acre-feet of water being retained in or redirected toward Lake Powell to protect one of the most important reservoirs in the American West. But the meaning of that number has changed over the course of this story. It no longer represents water arriving from a generous winter or a river suddenly returning to strength. It represents water being moved from one vulnerable part of the system to another, like blood redirected toward a failing organ, while the rest of the body absorbs the strain. Flaming Gorge gives up part of its reserve. Lake Powell gains elevation. Lake Mead receives less. Hoover Dam loses part of its hydropower margin. Farms, cities, tribal nations, ecosystems, and power agencies begin calculating what the next adjustment could cost. The emergency plan may protect critical infrastructure through the immediate danger. That matters. It buys operators time, preserves options, and reduces the risk of Lake Powell falling through a threshold that would severely constrain Glen Canyon Dam. But the plan cannot answer the larger question, because the larger question is not where the basin can find another temporary block of stored water. It is how long the entire system can continue moving scarcity around without reducing the imbalance that created the emergency. The Colorado River is still flowing. Water is still reaching homes, fields, treatment plants, and turbines. The great dams remain standing, and the major cities of the Southwest are not waiting for their taps to run dry tomorrow morning. That reality must remain clear. Panic would obscure the actual danger. The river does not need to disappear for the system around it to become unstable. It only needs to deliver less water than the network of laws, infrastructure, crops, power contracts, and human expectations was built to receive. That instability arrives gradually. It appears first as a lower release schedule, a lost planting season, a turbine producing fewer megawatts, a rural well that must be deepened, a marina that moves again, or a city paying more to pump the same water across the desert. Each event may look manageable on its own. Together, they reveal a system consuming its safety margin, one decision at a time. August could sharpen that reality. Updated projections may alter reservoir operations, shortage levels, and the balance of risk between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Negotiators may move closer to new rules, or the divisions among states and water users may become more visible. Yet August will not create the crisis. It will measure it. The forecast will translate mountain snow, dry soil, heat, evaporation, reservoir storage, and human demand into a set of operating choices. Those choices will show how much flexibility remains and which users are expected to protect the system next. The danger is not that one model will dictate the future with perfect accuracy. The danger is that every new model begins from a lower reservoir, a warmer basin, and a shorter distance from the next critical threshold. The river has entered a period when time itself has become part of the shortage. A reduction negotiated early can be planned. A reduction imposed after a threshold is crossed becomes an emergency. Infrastructure built before failure can protect communities. Infrastructure proposed after failure may arrive too late. Water conserved while reservoirs still hold a buffer can preserve choices. Water conserved only after that buffer disappears may determine who survives the disruption and who does not. That is why the emergency plan matters even beyond the water it moves. It is a warning that the basin is approaching the limit of delay. The lesson is not that human management has failed completely. The opposite is also visible. Cities have reduced per-person use. Farmers have participated in conservation programs. Engineers have built deeper intakes and more efficient systems. Scientists have improved forecasts. Tribal nations have fought for recognition and a stronger voice. Federal agencies and basin states have repeatedly prevented the reservoirs from reaching the most dangerous outcomes. These achievements prove that adaptation is possible. But adaptation cannot be measured only by whether catastrophe was avoided this year. It must be measured by whether the next year begins with more resilience or merely with another emergency postponed. The Colorado River can still have wet winters. Reservoirs can rise. Snow can return to the mountains, and powerful storms can produce years of relief. Those years should be welcomed, but they cannot be mistaken for a return to the old climate. In a warmer basin, wet years must rebuild reserves against greater evaporation, drier soils, earlier snowmelt, and growing pressure from every user connected to the system. Recovery will no longer mean watching the shoreline rise for one season. It will mean reducing long-term demand, protecting essential infrastructure, correcting historical inequities, and writing rules that function when the river delivers less than people hoped. The image that remains is not an empty canyon. It is a narrowing corridor of water between two enormous walls, still moving, still supporting millions, but carrying more promises than certainty. The emergency plan is trying to keep that corridor open. The decisions made around it will determine whether the river remains a managed system or becomes a sequence of crises governed by whichever threshold arrives next. This emergency will eventually pass from the headlines. The transfers will be completed. The August projections will be replaced by later forecasts. Another winter will arrive, and attention may shift toward the next storm, fire, election, or disaster. But what the emergency has revealed will remain. A water system built to store the past is now being forced to negotiate with the future. The Colorado River is not asking whether society can save every gallon, preserve every use, or restore every reservoir to a remembered shoreline. It is asking whether 40 million people, 7 states, 30 tribal nations, 2 countries, vast agricultural regions, and one interconnected power system can agree to live within a river that is becoming less predictable and less forgiving. The answer has not yet been written, but the river is already rewriting the rules.